In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. So nice to be with you here yet again, week after week, bringing you a variety of topics in theology and apologetics, politics, economics, and just really many issues from a Christian worldview perspective. Whether you are a believer, a seeker, or a non-believer, I hope that this program is encouraging to you. One of the purposes of the show is to illustrate, hey, we Christians can have good reasons for what we believe. We have a rational faith. It's not just something that we believe willy-nilly, but we've given some serious consideration to many issues, concerns against, religious belief in general, or specific topics like why does God allow evil. On today's show, we're going to be looking at archaeological discoveries. So when we go and do science, we dig in the ground. Does what the ground tell us affirm what the Bible tells us happened long ago? And joining us on our program today is Ted Wright. He's the founder of Epic Archaeology. He's a great speaker and teacher, really enthusiastic about archaeology. And Ted, as you know, there are many folks who, it's a very dry discipline, pun intended, dry archaeology, yes. I know I've used that with you a few times now. But you really have an enthusiasm about you that makes it entertaining and it keeps people engaged. So I really appreciate that about you.
Thank you.
Now, two things here to start. You obviously got the red shirt memo today,
Yeah.
So well done.
Thank you.
And then this past week we had D-Day, June 6th, where we commemorated and thought of and honored those soldiers who gave their lives on the beaches of Normandy. So before we jump into looking at archaeological discoveries which affirm the Bible, maybe we could think about how archaeology plays into D-Day.
Yeah, Kurt, that is a great insight. In fact, my grandfather, my Papa Bruce, as I called him, and many of my cousins and relatives called him Papa Bruce, he actually drove a landing barge on D-Day on June 6, 1944. And many years ago when he passed away, one of my uncles actually gave me his Navy Blue Jackets manual, and it contained a lot of photographs and a lot of amazing historical insights, actually, into the battle, the day of the battle. Many years ago, when I was actually teaching archaeology at the undergraduate level, I was preparing for my notes one day, and I was trying to figure out how in the world can I explain the whole process of historiography and archaeology to my undergrad students. And I just happened to be thinking about my grandfather and everything, and it just sort of a light bulb came on, and I thought, well, this is a great analogy to the archaeology of the Bible. And so I'll explain what I mean by that. So whenever we're wanting to reconstruct the past, and the most fundamental question, whether it's D-Day, and we just celebrated this and we commemorated the 75th anniversary just past a couple of days ago, and we have veterans who are now dying off, and they were eyewitnesses. There was a video that I saw of a guy who was like 97 years old, and he jumped out of an airplane. He was an airborne ranger, and he jumped out of an airplane on the beaches of Normandy 75 years later. Just remarkable. But there's going to come a time in which the eyewitnesses are gone. The only thing we have left are the historical records that they have left behind. So whether it's their diaries or whether it is their own writings, the government writings, government reports, things like that, those that we would consider historical documents. And then also we have the archaeological remains. So to summarize, I would say it this way: that how do we know the past? Well, we know the past by what scholars call primary sources. And there are three basic primary sources that we look at. And number one is eyewitnesses, someone who had to have been there, whether it was D-Day or whatever it was. The second one is historical records. And the third is archaeological remains. And so there's actually French archaeologists that are still combing the beaches of Normandy and still finding archaeological remains of the actual D-Day invasion. On a little sidebar note, on since we're talking about World War II history, I believe it was Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was one of the Allied commanders, as the U.S. forces were pushing into Europe and they began to liberate France eventually, and then into other countries, and then of course then eventually Germany itself. They began to uncover these concentration camps, these horrible places. And Eisenhower had the presence of mind to say that, I can't repeat exactly what he said on the air here, but he said, somebody get a camera and record this, because he said one day some sucker is going to say that this never happened. And and that's true today. There are people today who deny that the Holocaust ever happened. So that's how we know histories. We know it through eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological remains. And that's a perfect segue then to talking about how we know the past according to the Bible. So that's the way I would say it.
On last week's program, we were joined by Corey Miller, and we talked about leaving Mormonism, which, by the way, we had some flack come in from folks on Facebook, and I'll bring this back to archaeology in a moment here. I do want to read some of this, though. Kevin Drendel said, nice interview, which is good. Kevin's been a viewer of ours for a while. Linda Thorpe, though, seems like she's screaming at us when she writes in all caps. She says, if you are not Mormon, then why bring it up? Stop bashing. And I wonder if Linda really took the time to listen to the episode, as she could hear that Corey and I were talking about Mormonism, and we were doing so in a very civil way. So we were talking about the worldview, not people. So we weren't bashing, but one can critique. And so here's, Corey wrote an interesting response here. He wrote, 70,000 Mormon missionaries have one and only one main point on their first of 5 discussions in people's homes. Do you know what that is? To create the felt need for living profit by judging all other Christians as following falsehood. Who is bashing? In the book, the 4 of us scholars graciously but truthfully and lovingly tell why we've come to see why that judgment of other Christians is false. Hence, we left Mormonism to pursue Jesus, not to bash. So there, Corey had a swift response there. And we had some other folks who wrote some comments that are almost incoherent. I'm not sure exactly what they mean, but I think they were a little displeased there. I say all of this because leaving Mormonism, as we brought up briefly on last week's episode, we talked about the lack of archaeological evidence. Ted, you mentioned the 3 primary sources. I was taking notes here: eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological remains or discoveries there.
Yes.
And so with Mormonism, you lack that third category entirely.
Yes.
On it, which is problematic.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
All right. So, why don't we get into? This show we've kind of geared towards looking at 10 archaeological discoveries. I don't know if they're the top 10, but they're 10 important ones. I mean, they're all important. They're all exciting to see how what we find and discover in the earth corroborates the story that we're told, and that goes a real long way toward reliability. Indicating the reliability of a text of the historical record. So why don't you sort of have at it here, and I'm sure I'll chime in every once in a while, but this is your bread and butter, and I sort of want you to take it away here.
Okay. Thank you, Kurt. I would just preface it by saying this. People ask all the time, and we've written articles on this on our website, Epic Archaeology, the top 10 discoveries or top, of the New Testament or the Old Testament. And so as an archaeologist, though, as someone who's trained in archaeology and who's excavated in Israel, I'm a little bit hesitant to talk about any top 10 anything. Because archaeology really doesn't work that way. I mean, anybody who does archaeology in the professional realm knows that it's really a cumulative science. It's an inductive science. So there's very seldom do you find one thing that absolutely gives you 100% certainty. The way I would describe it is this. So years ago, I used to work. I worked at a plant. And in quality control, and so you're making these parts, and you're making thousands of parts a day. And in quality control, sometimes you will slowly check, pull a part out to make sure that it's following standard. So I would say that archaeology is sort of like that. So we haven't found everything. We haven't looked at every single solitary thing in the ancient Near East. But what we have sampled so far, what we have seen in the ground so far, has been very reliable, confirming that the Bible is a historically reliable document. And the reason why that's important is because the very core truth of the Christian faith, the very thing that we hold to as Christians, is the resurrection, the historical bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And of course, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he says, if Christ had not been risen, then our faith is futile, it's empty, and we're still dead in our transgressions and sins. So that's how I'd sort of preface it by talking about any top 10 list, is that it's sort of a cumulative case. So we can begin in the Old Testament, and again, we're talking here about some significant archaeological discoveries as we sort of take a sample through biblical history. And the first one that I want to talk about is something that many Christians, of course, believe by faith, and we teach it in Sunday school, we teach it in church, and but the archaeological evidence is something that people are not quite fully aware of, there's some mixed articles out there. I've got a lot of books in my library, of course, some Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias and things like that, and some of them get it right, some of them get it wrong. So this is just my view on this. People may disagree with this, but there are people that I highly respect, scholars and archaeologists. And it's the Tower of Babel. If you know in biblical history, the very first, of course, what scholars call primeval history. So Genesis 1 through 6 or 7, or really Genesis 1 through 10, up to the Tower of Babel. So we have creation of Adam and Eve all the way up to the time of the flood. And I know that's a very controversial subject. Some Christians hold to a local flood, some Christians hold to a global flood. Maybe we can talk about that later, but that's not necessarily something I want to talk about right now. So I do want to talk about the Tower of Babel because that is one of the very first major events that happens on the earth after the flood. So what's interesting about this is sort of using a reverse engineering sort of understanding, is that we look and archaeologists have been digging in the Near East, in the ancient Near East, for a little over 100 years, actually about 150 years or so. And in the area where we believe the Tower of Babel is located is in an area called Mesopotamia, which means land between the rivers, and that is in modern day Iraq. And archaeologists have uncovered the ancient Babylonian city of Ur of the Chaldees, which is where Abraham was born. So many people think that that's probably where the Tower of Babel was located. But in actuality, the archaeological evidence points to another location, an earlier location that actually is in the same area. It's very, very close, in fact, to the biblical side, or to the ancient site of Ur, and that is in a city called Eridu, Eridu. It's located in southeastern Iraq, and it is one of the most fascinating archaeological sites on Earth. The reason why we believe that the Tower of Babel is in Ur, for multiple reasons. It is the earliest city in the world. There's no city that's dated earlier than Ur. Of course, it's built on virgin sand. Now, I will say this as a little side note. The city of Jericho, which it goes by the Arabic name Tel El Sultan, actually some of the earliest layers date back to what's called the Neolithic, or the Stone Age. So some people might argue, was it really a city? But depends on how you define city. So the first true city was the city of Eridu, and there was a huge temple platform, a huge complex, and which was abandoned in a period that archaeologists call the Late Uruk period. We call this the Late Uruk expansion. So basically, to put this in English, there's this very, very early city built in southeastern Iraq. It has this huge foundation, and we believe that they were beginning to build one of the earliest towers that we now know. We call them ziggurats, which is basically looks like a pyramid with steps. So it's like a stepped pyramid. And they begin the base of it. So there's this large base of it, and the Bible says that God came down and confounded the language, and they began to spread out. Well, if that really happened, then what do we see in the archaeological record? Is there any indication that there was a dispersal of people in this time? And that's exactly what we find in the late Uruk expansion. So how do we know this archaeologically? Is it we just making this up, or is this something that we see archaeologically?
Right.
Well, here's how we know. Well, in archaeology, the name of the game is pottery. Pottery is so important in archaeology. It's important for we could do a whole show just on pottery, but we'd bore people to death. So I'll try to do that. But the way we identify the way we identify different layers and date those periods are called by diagnostic pottery. So these are the pieces of pottery that identify the particular layer with the particular time. The best way to explain that would be sort of like, Coca-Cola was invented in the 1890s in America, and if you find an old Coke bottle out in your backyard, you know that somewhere deep down in your yard, that layer is going to date back to the 1890s or so. So Coke bottle styles change over time, pottery styles change over time, so these stylistic changes in pottery allow archaeologists to date sites. Not only that, we can also see if people are making the same kind of pottery in other locations. And so with this ancient site of Eridu, in the late Uruk expansion, some of the diagnostic pottery are something called beveled rim bowls. So these would be like a very, very crude clay bowl with they were made in molds. And so we have the bevel rim bowls, and then we also have what's called the large spouted jar. And so it's basically a little clay jar with a long spout in it. And interestingly, Kurt, this is actually contained beer. Beer is one of the oldest commodities in the world, and there's lots of archaeological evidence that beer was actually the money that was paid to the builders of the pyramid. They were actually paid in beer, so you can imagine that. You don't hear that a lot on Christian shows, but that's actually historically accurate.
Yeah.
Beer is a very, very ancient commodity. So these spouted jars, these bevel rim bowls. So what's interesting archaeologically is when you look at the city of Eridu, this culture, this material culture, spreads out. It goes north. We see it in Turkey. We see it in Egypt. We see it north, south, east, and west. So there is this archaeological culture that spreads out in this time frame where they're beginning to build this tower, this huge ziggurat, but it's left uncompleted. In fact, the site is abandoned in the late Uruk period. Why? Well, we know the Bible gives us the reason why, because God confounded the language. But there's something also interesting about this as well, is that the cultures that we believe came from Eridu, when they went to these other locations like Anatolia, they lived separately from the people around them. So there were other little small groups, but they were basically living in segregated communities. So obviously they probably couldn't speak the same language. The inference is that they were speaking a different language and they were living separately. Sort of like, you go to a larger city like New York and you have, people that speak Chinese in one area and people that speak, Italian and all that kind of thing. Same thing was happening in the ancient world. So here is the archaeological evidence, I believe, for the Tower of Babel. One other little thing, there's just so much on this. To me, it's fascinating. The earliest pyramid builders actually built, the earliest tombs in Egypt are actually something called a mastaba, which is basically like a platform, a large rectangular platform. And then after this, they begin to build on the top of them. So the earliest pyramids in Egypt look almost identical to ziggurats, which means that they took that culture and they spread. And it's a really good archaeological evidence to me for the Tower of Babel. This is a historical event. It's not some myth. It wasn't just made up. The Bible is historically accurate, and the archaeological evidence backs it up. So that's just to begin.
Yeah, and I didn't even know that there was much of any archaeological corroboration to that story. Great to hear that there is. I'm a bit more familiar with other discoveries, especially like from the New Testament. That's always, I think, fascinated me a bit more. But okay, so we've got the Tower of Babel. What are some other discoveries?
Okay, so the other discovery that I would mention, I think, is really important, and I included this in one of my article in the top 10 Old Testament discoveries. It may seem kind of odd to include in a show, but for archaeology, it is so very important, not only for archaeology and Egyptology, but also for Old Testament studies. And we'll talk about some New Testament discoveries as well, but I want to mention this. Many people are familiar with, in fact, most people, I would say, even who really don't follow or read much archaeology, are familiar with the Rosetta Stone, which is the famous inscription that was found by Napoleon Bonaparte's troops. It was actually specifically a French commander named Lieutenant Bouchard was actually reinforcing a French fort called Fort Julian, and they were fighting the Mamelukes that were allies to the Ottoman Turks in a battle called the Battle of the Pyramids in 1798, 1799. And so they were reinforcing this fort, and they uncovered this huge slab of granite, and it had a trilingual inscription on it. And the inscription, of course, is three languages. It's on the bottom, it's Greek. The middle, it's a language called Demotic, and the top language is hieroglyphic. Of course, Napoleon was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 by the British, and when the British actually, he was defeated in 1815. But what I wanted to refer to is that he actually, when he was in Egypt, he fled back to France and left many of the scholars in Egypt to sort of continue their work. And the British Navy came in, and they allowed the French to keep most of their stuff, but they took the Rosetta Stone back to England, which is in the British Museum today. It's still there today.
Yeah.
The key is that, why I talk about this, because for many, many years, hundreds of years, the understanding of hieroglyphics was completely in the dark. People didn't know how to read hieroglyphics. Even Napoleon's troops didn't know how to read it. So there was a race that ensued in Europe to know how to read hieroglyphics. And in England, there was a scholar by the name of Thomas Young, and in France, there was a young French scholar by the name of Jean-François Champollion. You have to say it with a French accent. So Champollion, and they actually were working together to try. They were actually kind of sort of, competing,
but working together.
Exactly. They would use each other's work, and Thomas Young did a lot of work on this, and Champollion was eventually the one who was able to unlock the Rosetta Stone. What this did for Old Testament studies is it unlocked ancient Egypt, because much of the Pentateuch, much of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, has a very strong, at least some of the culture that's recorded in it, has a very strong Egyptian flavoring. Now, why I say that? Because in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is speaking to the Sanhedrin, and he's giving a speech right before he's stoned, he says that Moses was trained in all the ways of the Egyptian, was a man of power in word and deed, is what Stephen said. So if that is the case, or since that is the case, and most traditional Jewish and Christian scholars hold to Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, even if it perhaps was edited and compiled later, not compiled, but polished later by other scribes, the core essence of the Torah was written by Moses himself. If that is the case, then you would expect to find internal evidence in the text itself of the Egyptian flavoring, and in fact, you do. And a couple of examples of that. And am I going too fast here? So it's just
this is fine.
Okay. So one of the things that we didn't know, and many people have read the story before. They know the story very well. Many people around Easter. I don't know why Easter they always show the. I guess maybe it's because of the Passover. They show the 10 Commandments. With Charlton Heston.
Yeah.
But the story of the plagues, the Nile turning to blood, and all these things happening. But one of the things that we see now that we understand Egyptian hieroglyphics is we're able to read these hieroglyphics and understand Egyptian culture in a much deeper and richer way. And one of the functions of archaeology, I believe it actually has 3 functions when it comes to biblical studies and apologetics. Number one, it can affirm the reliability of the biblical text. It can say, this happened, or this didn't happen, or the evidence is inconclusive. Number 2, it can clarify certain passages in the Bible, and number 3, it can illuminate certain passages in the Bible as well. So here's a case in which I think that the hieroglyphic and the Egyptian cultural understanding of the Pentateuch really provides illumination and clarification for these passages. So one example would be in between Exodus chapter 7 and 12, we read about the 10 plagues, and there, of course, many people have written about this, and there's a really great book on it by John Currid called Ancient Egypt in the Old Testament that I'd recommend for folks to get if they want to read more about this. But it outlines the plagues as they were unfolding in Egypt. And one of the things that Currid and others say is that the plagues in Egypt, each of the plagues actually corresponds to an Egyptian god. So the plague of the Nile turning to blood. Well, the Nile was the life blood of Egypt, and there was a god of the Nile. So in making the Nile turn to blood, God was essentially saying to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh that you are not in control, I am in control. Also to the Israelites as well. So it was sort of this polemical back and forth between the gods of Egypt, which were non-existent, and the God of the Hebrews, which is the true God. At least that's what I think that's what the text is saying. So this is going on, and we wouldn't have known that had we not had Egyptian hieroglyphics to help us to understand who the Egyptian gods were and what they were in control of. So when you read all the plagues and all this chaos is happening upon Egypt, this is also another very interesting insight that we get from Egyptian culture. And the other one is an Egyptian concept known as Ma'at, M-A-A-T. And I've talked about this before in some of the videos we've created. But Ma'at, I can't emphasize enough how important this was in Egyptian culture. Ma'at, especially for the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh his number one job was to keep essentially order in Egypt, because there was always forces of chaos that were trying to keep Egypt in chaos. There was the annual flood, there were plagues, there were famines, and all these different kinds of things. It wasn't just in the Exodus account. There are accounts of other plagues and things like that. But his role was to keep law and order in Egypt. And if he did not do this, when the Pharaoh died, then of course he was going to be judged, and not only was he going to be judged, but his heart was going to be judged as well, and he had to watch over his heart lest it become hard. And so there are very detailed papyri manuscripts that have been discovered all throughout Egypt, and we see these scenes on the temple walls and palace walls, and we see it in papyrus manuscripts as well, from an Egyptian funeral text called the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and it shows a scene in which the Pharaoh's heart is weighed in the afterlife against the feather of the goddess Ma'at, or truth. So if the heart was heavy, then it would outweigh the feather, and the Pharaoh would be condemned in the afterlife. So whenever you read in the account between Exodus 7 and 12, Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart. So the Bible, there's sort of this building intensity and heavying of the heart of the Pharaoh, which is a very strong polemic against the Pharaoh himself from his own culture. So we would not have understood that had it not been for archaeology. So it's just one other example of how archaeology illuminates the Bible and helps us to really understand that.
Right. So the Rosetta Stone itself doesn't, isn't referenced in the scripture or anything like that. But without it,
yes,
we wouldn't know any of this.
Yes.
And some of these things, like the plagues, maybe they were just made up. There are some scholars who think that the Pentateuch was written, 500, 400 years before Christ, which is, much very distant from the claims it makes about when it happened.
Absolutely.
And so, that's why the Rosetta Stone's important.
Absolutely.
All right, what's the third discovery?
Okay, so I'm going to group these in together as sort of one discovery, although they're really three, and I can sort of summarize these fairly quickly. And I would call these the Conquest Cities. So we talked about the Exodus a little bit. There's a whole lot more on that we could talk about, but let's jump to the Conquest now. And so there are three cities that were only. So let me back up and talk about the Conquest for a moment. Just recently, Kurt, I think last year we had the conference on the Canaanite genocide and whether or not God commanded them, harem, to completely annihilate all the Canaanites, destroy all. But when you carefully read the text, there were only three cities that were harem, and that was Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. There was three cities. So archaeologically, we know where all three cities are now. I believe, and we've excavated, not me personally, but archaeologists. I've excavated at one of the sites, but all three have been excavated. Jericho, I mentioned it earlier, is one of the oldest cities or oldest archaeological sites in the world. The earliest layers of Jericho date back to the Neolithic period. And in the 1930s, Jericho was excavated by John Garstang and the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. And Garstang discovered, of course, the conquest narrative. Many people are familiar with the story. The Israelites marched around the city walls, blew the trumpets, and the walls came a-tumbling down. So the question is there archaeological evidence for this? Now, here's where the controversy comes in, and I'll kind of explain it. So basically, Garstang discovered, and let me back up just a hair and talk about the archaeological site itself. So in Israel, in the Near East, whenever you find a city, you find it in something called a tell. It's Tell. It's an Arabic word which means an artificial mound or hill. So these cities would be sequentially built up over time. So that means that the lowest city would be the earliest city, and so on and so on. So the top city would be the earliest city or the latest city. So at Jericho, it's a very large tell, very large, a lot of occupation, and so. At City 4, which is the fourth stratum at Jericho, John Garstang discovered a late Bronze Age city based on the pottery that had a double-walled, it was a double-fortified, it was very, just like the Bible says, it was fortified, very, very well fortified. And at City 4, he found on a couple of places the wall was completely breached. The wall had basically fallen beneath itself. So basically at Jericho, there was a lower wall called a revetment wall, and then there's an upper wall, which is another like 15 or 20 feet on top of it. And then inside of that, you've got another section of wall as well. But in City 4, when Garstang excavated there, the wall had literally fallen down below the slopes, which interestingly formed a ramp right up into the city. And when you read the biblical account in Joshua, it says literally that the walls fell beneath themselves. That's the literal Hebrew wording of that, and the archaeology matches it perfectly. So, but there's more. You get more with this. Not only the walls have fallen down, but also when Garstang excavated there, he found pottery that had been left in place. So whoever or whatever force it was that destroyed this city of Jericho in the late Bronze Age,
they didn't ransack.
They didn't take anything. They left it all, and they burned. And they found the burned grain. You can hold it in your hand, the burned grain from this, which matches the biblical description exactly to a T. Now, fast forward the clock a bit. Kathleen Kenyon came along about 20 or 30 years later, and she excavated Jericho again using some different techniques. And she's a good archaeologist, but for whatever reason, and it's still a mystery to this day, she failed to record a particular kind of pottery, because we talked about pottery and how pottery helps us to date sites. There's this kind of pottery that's found at Jericho, not just Jericho, but also in other sites in Israel called Cypriot bichrome pottery. So whenever you find this kind of pottery at a particular site, it's going to date to the late Bronze Age. Well, there were literally thousands upon thousands of this Cypriot bichrome pottery at Jericho, but she failed to record it, or at least she barely mentioned it. And who knows the reason why, but when she fails to mention this and she emphasizes the other pottery, then she redates the site to a latter time period, essentially sweeping away the conquest of Jericho. So scholars today, when they, if you look up the Wikipedia article on Jericho, they're going to look at the Kathleen Kenyon date. Those of us who hold that the historical, the Bible is historically reliable, we believe on good, not just biblical grounds, but also archaeological grounds, that there's evidence for the destruction of Jericho, that John Garstang was actually correct, and that he did good archaeology, and it's based on the pottery. Because we find that kind of pottery in other sites, we know it dates it to the late Bronze Age, which is when the conquest would have happened. So that's Jericho. The second site is Ai, which.
Before we get to that, I know we want to get to Ai and a couple other cities. We do have to take a break here, Ted.
Yes.
I know this is exciting stuff. We've talked about the Tower of Babel, the Rosetta Stone, and beginning to talk about the Conquest Cities here, starting with Jericho. But when we come back, we'll get to Ai and Hatzor, and I guess a whole bunch of other discoveries as well. It's really fascinating to learn all of this stuff. Might seem like a whirlwind tour, but it's great to even just look at the tip of the iceberg on this stuff. And for those that are interested, they certainly can go to your website, epicarchaeology.org, check out more. But be sure to stick with us right now through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Lycona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill podcast with Kurt Jarris, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888, and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you want to learn how you can become a sponsor or a patron, the patrons are folks that just chip in a couple bucks each month, you can go to our website, veracityhill.com, click on that patron tab to learn more. On today's episode, we're looking at archaeological discoveries which affirm the Bible. We're joined by Ted Wright, the founder of Epic Archaeology. But before continuing there, I want to let you know about a really great book by Ken Samples of Reasons to Believe called Classic Christian Thinkers. You know, many of us pick up Christian theology and history in a sort of piecemeal way, making it difficult to understand its significance. But in his new book, Classic Christian Thinkers, philosopher and theologian Ken Samples offers a masterful summary of the lives of Christianity's greatest defenders. The history of these 9 timeless truth seekers overflows from the pages of the Bible into history itself. Take a step toward a richer faith by visiting reasons.org/veracity and order your copy of Classic Christian Thinkers today. Well, Ted, in the first half of the program, we talked about the Tower of Babel, the Rosetta Stone, and you clued us in about the Conquest Cities here, talking about Jericho to start. And I had to cut you off, but let's continue back to AI. I've seen different, it's just 2 letters. It's pronounced I. Okay.
I'm told by people that know. The actual site it's in the West Bank in Israel. It's called Khirbet El Makader, and the team that I excavated with, they excavated there for goodness about 15 or 17 years or so, and there's really strong evidence that this is the actual biblical site of Ai. It was destroyed in the late Bronze Age. I've actually been there, excavated along the Canaanite wall facing north, which is where the Israelites, Joshua and the armies of Israel, led the king of Ai out of the gate. The gates were left open. The armies of Israel came in from the back, and they invaded, so it was a kind of a classic ambush. The city was burned, just like Jericho was left. And then the third city that was destroyed is the city of Hatzor as well. And that was there's archaeological evidence for the late Bronze Age destruction as well at Hatzor. So these 3 cities we find archaeologically. So when we talk about the conquest, I think archaeologically we got to be careful. It wasn't just where they were going in and just wholesale killing everybody. There were these 3 cities. They burned. They left everything. And there's a reason for that, actually. From the Old Testament, we read about in when we go back to the Torah, and of course Moses would have been the author, the primary writer of the Torah. And the first fruit, we go back to Leviticus and we go back to Exodus, and when we read about the first fruit offering, we're kind of like, what is that? Why would they just not take anything in these cities and just burn them and give them to God, because it was a recognition by faith that God was the one who gave the victory. Just like in the first fruit offering in agriculture to the Israelites, when they were, let's just say you were growing a crop, and let's say a big crop of tomatoes. It's summertime, people love tomatoes, and imagine you care and tend for your tomato vines, and then you get that first beautiful red ripe tomato on the vine. Instead of taking it for yourself, you give it to God as a burnt offering, as a recognition that God is the one who gave it. So it's the same way that the Israelite and Joshua, they were giving these cities to God as a recognition that God was the one who was the one giving them the victory. Of course, he of course gave them victory through his power. So that's kind of the reasoning behind that, I believe, when you look at the Old Testament. So the Exodus and then the Conquest Cities, and there's just so much we could talk about, Kurt. Yeah. One thing I'll mention in passing, and maybe we can perhaps do a show on this later, and I'm going to write. I want to write more about this. Is the existence of King David, the Davidic Solomonic Empire. So it's a big one of the big issues in Old Testament archaeology and scholarship is the existence of David and Solomon. And scholars today, Old Testament scholars, debate this. Archaeologists debate it. In Israel, there's a big divide in Israel among Israeli archaeologists. Some think that he was complete fiction, that he didn't exist, or if he did, he was sort of like a King Arthur type figure. One archaeologist in Israel's name is Israel Finkelstein, and there's some other archaeologists as well who think that the Davidic Solomonic kingdom was complete myth. And of course, we believe, as those who trust the Bible, that they really did exist. But what amazes me is that some people who don't say that he existed, they ignore some of the inscriptional evidence that actually shows that he did exist. One example I'll give is called the Tel Dan inscription. This is one of the first historical inscriptions containing a reference to King David. It was found in 1993 at a place called Tel Dan in northern Israel by the archaeologist Avraham Biram. The inscription dates to the 9th century BC and is from an Aramean king who boasts that he defeated his two southern neighbors, and that the house of Israel, Beit Israel, and the house of David, Beit David, or Beth David, the house of David, were defeated. And this is the first historical reference to David outside of the Old Testament. So so that's just one inscription. And again, there are many, and that's one of the functions, again, of archaeology, is it can affirm whether or not someone existed. We can debate about the extent of his kingdom later. Maybe that's a subject for another time. But certainly David existed. Jesus affirmed him. There's no reason to doubt his existence, and we have good archaeological evidence for that.
It's fascinating to consider how scholars have, for about 150 years, have just proposed that what we read in the scriptures just made up, just fantasy, never happened. There are these nice little stories for teaching children, but we know better. And so part of this is because, they had a certain standard of what would constitute as good evidence. And at that time that they were alive, there wasn't the evidence. It wasn't yet brought to light. But now, literally brought to light out of the dirt. But now we can see here, actually, hey, even on your standard, on your methodology, we do have evidence that says that city was there. That character or figure is historical, was a real person. And it's fascinating to see how the scripture, throughout the decades and now the centuries, does nothing but affirm what the story tells us.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So we can talk about one more Old Testament one. I think this is probably one of the strongest bits of historical and archaeological evidence for the Old Testament, at least as far as archaeological and historical corroboration between what the Bible says and what the archaeology and what the history says. And this would be, the artifact would be called the Oriental Institute prism. And I think we may have a picture of that people can look at. So there it is. And what you're looking at is, it's also called the Sennacherib prism. There are actually three of these. There's one in the British Museum called the Taylor Prism, and there's also one in Israel as well. And there are three identical inscriptions that essentially date the conquest, or at least the besiegement of Israel by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who invaded Samaria, or northern Israel. He also was going to subdue the southern kingdoms as well, culminating in the siege of Jerusalem. In which, when you read the Old Testament, and in fact the Old Testament references are Isaiah 33, 36, 2 Chronicles 32, 2 Kings chapter 19. All of these references talk about in detail this Assyrian besiegement of Sennacherib. So the archaeologists uncovered this, and basically what it says is this, and I'm going to sort of read I'm going to summarize what it says on the prism. This is Sennacherib speaking here, and he says, "As for Hezekiah, king of Judah, who had not submitted to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, along with many smaller towns taken in battle with my battering rams. I took as plunder 200,150 people, both small and great, male and female, along with a great number of animals, including horses, mules, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep. And as for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem." End quote. So that's a remarkable historical connection between the Old Testament and the archaeological record. Not only do we have these three prisms in the Taylor Prism, the Oriental Institute Prism, but we also have the city of Nineveh himself, which was the actual royal residence of Sennacherib, and he basically plastered on the sides of the walls this event. Of course, he didn't take Jerusalem, but he did destroy and take the city of Lachish, which was a main city that was fortified on the way into Jerusalem. So if you're going to go in, if you're an Assyrian army and you're going to go in and take Jerusalem, you've got to take Lachish because it was in the main road leading to Jerusalem, and so it was sort of a stop along the way. And we have ample evidence of this in the archaeological record at Lachish, as well as in the Assyrian records at Nineveh, the site in Iraq today. So couple other things too about this time period. This is the 8th century BC, so approximately 701 BC. We have the Taylor Prism, we have the Oriental Institute Prism, we have the one in Jerusalem. I don't know what it's called. I think it may be called the Jerusalem Prism. I'm not sure, but it's the same prism written in Akkadian cuneiform. But so when Hezekiah got word that Sennacherib was coming and on his way, he made preparations for Jerusalem because he knew the Assyrians, when they would basically surround the city, they would cut off the water supply. They began to dig a tunnel. They cut off the Gihon Spring north of the city, and then it would run underground, and they built a tunnel to get to the water source so the Israelites could have drinking water and could hold out for basically forever because they'd have a water source. And so that today it's called the Siloam Tunnel inscription. And this was an inscription that was found, and Hezekiah talks about this. And you can see it. You can actually go. Many people who have been to Israel have actually been in the tunnel that was built by Hezekiah or his workers to get water coming into the city. The other preparation that Hezekiah did was he actually broadened the walls of the city of Jerusalem, making them thicker, so that the Assyrians would not breach the walls. In fact, the Bible says that they tore down residences in Jerusalem to make room for the wall. And the archaeologists found this. I believe it was in the 1990s. I think, off the top of my head, and it's called Hezekiah's Broad Wall in Jerusalem. So you can actually go there today and stand on top of Hezekiah's Broad Wall, which dates to the 8th century BC. So we've got incredible evidence that this is historically reliable. And this is just, as I like to tell my students, we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
To use a mixed metaphor.
Wow. I mean, this is already a lot. Most of this is from the Old Testament.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, surely there's been stuff from the New Testament that we've discovered.
Absolutely. Kurt, so one of the first things I would like to show folks, and I think we may have a slide of this, is we talked about earlier, we were talking about the three primary sources. and we're talking about history, the very first thing we want early attestation and multiple attestation of historical sources. And what you're seeing there on the screen is something called the John Rylands fragment. It's called P52. It's papyrus. It was found, we believe, in the Oxyrhynchus collection in Egypt. It contains a passage from the Gospel of John. Interestingly, it's the passage where John is speaking to Pontius Pilate, and Pilate, and on the fragment itself, it actually has the question of Pilate: "What is truth?" And on the other side of the fragment, it says, "The truth will set you free." Isn't that ironic?
Wow.
That the earliest fragment we have, and it dates to the very, very early period of the second century rather, and we believe that this is actually it affirms that the Gospels were written before the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. So we're talking about early testimony, and not only do we have this fragment, we also have thousands and thousands of other fragments. Of the New Testament manuscript. In fact, recently on our Facebook, we posted a quote from, many people know Dr. Daniel Wallace, who is a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's also he also does work with the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, which they are actually recording manuscripts, new Greek manuscripts. And I want to find that quote for you. What Dr. Wallace says. He's actually quoting another source here, and it's pretty remarkable when he's talking here about primary sources and about the manuscript evidence for the Bible. And
what's really neat about what Dan Wallace is doing, we've had him on the program about a year ago. He's digitizing all these manuscripts, and one of the reasons why that's beneficial, I think of two immediately. One, the papyrus just wears out over time. I mean, and especially as it's dug out of whatever arid climate it was in, it changes. Now, of course, we're trying to temperature control, humidity control to just have the thing last as long as it can. Eventually, it will give out. So, to digitize it, you'd have the digital record pictures of this.
That's right.
Means as long as there is technology to view the JPEG file, it's there.
Yes.
Secondly, I can think of, you have like ISIS, which had been destroying things. They might be now obliterated, ISIS. I think. I'm not sure. At any rate,
they're still hanging on, I think.
Folks come and they want to destroy history and artifacts. By digitizing these items, we can still hold on to the memory and not lose them. Some things have been lost and will never be recovered. But by digitizing these manuscripts, it's a great way we can preserve their legacy.
That's exactly
Sorry,
right, Kurt.
Continue,
that's
Ted.
exactly right. In fact, I'll add to what you said. Not only is what Dr. Wallace is doing important, but he's sort of building on the University of Chicago at the Oriental Institute. They began back in the earliest days of archaeology and Egyptology. One of the founder of the Oriental Institute, James Henry Breasted, started something in Luxor, Egypt, called the Epigraphic Survey of Egypt, and they recognized even back then in the 1890s and the early 20th century that time and erosion is going to eventually wear down these monuments, or who knows what may happen to them, and they are carefully photographing and drawing many of the inscriptions in Egypt. They're still doing that to this day because there's just so much, and there's new stuff coming to light every day. So that's another very important point. Well, anyway, I found the quote, and this is actually from his book, Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament Manuscript, Patristic, and Apocryphal Evidence by Dan Wallace. Here's the quote. We're talking about New Testament archaeology and New Testament reliability. We talked about the John Rylands fragment, and now we're talking about the amount of manuscripts that we have of the New Testament. This is a quote from Dan Wallace. He says, "It would be safe to say that we have altogether about 20,000 handwritten manuscripts of the New Testament in various languages, including Greek. If someone were to destroy all those manuscripts, we would not be left without a witness, because of the Church Fathers wrote commentaries on the New Testament. To date, more than 1 million quotations by the New Testament Fathers have been recorded. If all other sources for our knowledge of the New Testament were destroyed, the patristic quotations would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. Wrote Metzger and Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, of all people, said this. So it's a very tacit admission from Bart Ehrman that we have got an incredible amount of evidence. In fact, I heard Dr. Wallace say this actually several years ago. I was in Texas, and one of the manuscript reveals were looking at some of these early Greek manuscripts, and Dr. Wallace actually said to the group that it was speaking to that we now have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to New Testament manuscripts. So looking at the New Testament, we're talking about very, very important manuscripts, and we've got amazing amount of manuscript evidence. So we mentioned eyewitnesses, we mentioned manuscripts, and I just want to read here. Of course, the Bible claims to be written by eyewitnesses. In fact, Luke in Luke's Gospel, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative, the things that have been accomplished among us. So in other words, he's writing here very early, and he says there's already been people writing about this. Just many have, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good for me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So Luke is here a very, very careful historian, and he is looking at the sources, and he's trying to get at accurate history. So we can debate about what kind of literature it is, but at the end of the day, I think the gospel writers are not writing about myth, they're not writing about fairy tale, they're writing about an event that actually happened in space and time. And so they claim to be eyewitnesses, but now we don't have the eyewitnesses to do it. So this is where archaeology comes in. Archaeology can really help us to see if the eyewitnesses are giving us accurate historical information. So when we come to the New Testament, as far as archaeology, there are just so many discoveries. It's difficult to really start in one place. So you just have to kind of dive in.
Yeah.
But let me just start with this. I'll just say this, that I think many people kind of looking from the outside in, looking at apologetics and looking at archaeology, and especially biblical archaeology, those who call ourselves biblical archaeologists, people who are kind of skeptical go, you're just out there trying to prove the Bible. You're just, you're out there, you got your shovel in one hand, your spade in one hand, your Bible in the other hand, and you're just out there trying to find any evidence to prove the Bible. Well, let me answer that by saying this. Many of the New Testament discoveries that actually affirm the historical and archaeological reliability of the New Testament were found by people not even Christian, not setting out to prove the Bible. Well, I'll give you two examples just off the top of my head. Number one would be the Pontius Pilate inscription that was found by Italian archaeologists working in the ancient city of Caesarea. They were excavating near an ancient amphitheater, and they found the stone. It had Latin writing on it, and lo and behold, guess what? It's Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. The second one was actually excavated in 1968, but it wasn't until last year until it was actually deciphered, and that was the Pontius Pilate ring. They actually found the signet ring of Pontius Pilate. Again, in archaeology, we can't. There's still a lot to be done in the lab. I mean, we're still digging up sites, but there are still incredible discoveries to be made in the museums and in the laboratories of many universities that have just incredible artifacts that don't have anybody to read or decipher them. So if you're out there and you want to get a degree in archaeology, there's still a lot of work to be done, and you don't even have to go dig. You can actually go to a museum and read these cuneiform manuscripts, or text rather, or any kind of inscriptional evidence. So get your degree in Greek or Aramaic or Hebrew and go be an archaeologist. That's just my little commercial there.
We've just got a couple minutes left here, but it's interesting you talked about the lab. You think archaeology it's done on site, but sometimes what happens, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert here. Sometimes the best place archaeologists will dig are on garbage heaps, ancient garbage heaps. That's where they can find all sorts of things, and then what they'll do is they'll just take it in boxes sometimes, and that's when they'll carry it to the lab. So it's not like you think Indiana Jones, they're there, cleaning the objects there on site. Sometimes you get that, but sometimes you get folks just digging things up in the sand, in the dirt, the items in a box, and then they will take it to a lab to be analyzed. Is that right?
That's exactly right. There is some preparation that there's been those who kind of are in academic archaeology know that this has been a problem for years and years and years. And that is that it's called the publication problem. So there's a huge gap between you have an excavation, let's say for the summer of 2019, we're excavating at site X in Israel, and there's a lot of information that comes out of the ground. Well, by the time it's published, the official report is published, it's been like months or years. That's been a problem. I think that with the advent of technology and computers, that has really, that gap has closed in recent years, because now you can actually bring your iPad or your camera, digital camera, to the site. You have drones now. You have all kinds of really high-tech imaging that can close the gap of those time. But yeah, a lot of that stuff is taken back and examined in the laboratory. It's taken by experts. In any archaeological site, you've got not just it's a whole huge team effort in which you have experts in the field, and you have all kinds of artifacts that you try to analyze, whether it's coins or pottery or objects or scarabs or whatever it is. You have an expert in any particular field.
Yeah, wow, that's great. Well, that's a good place to call it quits for today. This has been quite insightful, and I was keeping a tally here, Ted. I counted more than 10. I know 10 was our goal. Let me see. I'll do a run through here. Tower of Babel, Rosetta Stone, Conquest Cities, so that's 3, Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. You said the Tel Dan was discovered in 1993. Then you've got, the Tel Dan, that's about...
King David.
King David, yes, thank you.
Yes.
All right. Then you've got the Oi Prism, or the Sennacherib Prism. Then you've got Hezekiah's Tunnel, there's an inscription there. And then you've got the Hezekiah's Broad Wall. Then you've got the John Rylands Papyrus, Pontius Pilate inscription. And then in 1968, it was discovered the Pontius Pilate ring. So by my count, I think I've got 12 there, which is great.
And we haven't even
yeah, that's right.
Just started.
We'll have to do a part 2 and another 10 or 12 or so discoveries, and then it's just really wonderful.
Yes. So be encouraged, Christian. The Bible that you hold in your hand is historically and archaeologically reliable. It is an amazing book. So stay tuned. More discoveries to come.
Great, Ted. Thank you so much for joining us on our program today. That does it for the show this week. I am grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a few bucks each month. And if you want to learn more, please consider joining our team of supporters. $5, $10, $20 a month. Go to veracityhill.com/donate. I'm grateful for the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Fox Restoration, and Reasons to Believe. Thank you to our technical producer, Chris, for all the fine work that he does, and to our guest today, Ted Wright of Epic Archaeology. Last and certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.